All right, today for our ELA lesson, we completed chapter 2 of Stamped. And as a quick review of what Stamped chapter 1 was all about, we were introduced to the first racist, and he was identified as Zurara. And Zurara wrote a book that created these ideas that Africans, specifically Africans, were inferior to other races and in need of a savior because they were savage and because they needed God, and the only way they were going to get God is from these non-African people who believed in God and had a religion called Christianity. And really, his whole purpose of doing this was to make some money. He made some money. He wanted to just create this whole idea to make some money. And he actually was African himself. So that was one of the first ideas we were introduced to. Now we're going to listen to chapter 2. I will be stopping throughout the listening of chapter 2 to discuss things and just to make sure that you guys kind of understand what's going on. So we're going into chapter 2.
Chapter 2, Puritan Power. Okay, so by now, hopefully you're saying, wow, this really isn't like the history books I'm used to. And if you aren't saying that, well, you're a liar. And guess what? You wouldn't be the first. After Gomez Yanes de Zurara's ridiculous money-grabbing lie, there were other European race theorists who followed suit, using his text as a jumping-off point for their own concepts and racist ideas to justify the enslavement of Africans. Because if there's one thing we all know about humans, it's that most of us are followers, looking for something to be part of to make us feel better about our own selfishness. Or is that just me? Just me? Got it. Well, anyway, the followers came sniffing around, drumming up their own cockamamie, best word ever, even better than Zurara, though possibly a synonym, theories, two of which would set the table for the conversation around racism for centuries to come. Those theories were: 1. Climate theory. This actually came from Aristotle. We'll get back to him later, who questioned whether Africans were born this way or if the heat of the continent made them inferior. Many agreed it was climate and that if African people lived in cooler temperatures, they could, in fact, become white. And 2. Curse theory. In 1577, after noticing that Inuit people in northeastern freezing cold Canada were darker than the people living in the hotter south, English travel writer George Best determined, conveniently for all parties interested in owning slaves, that it couldn't have been climate that made darker people inferior, and instead determined that Africans were in fact cursed. First of all, could you imagine someone on the Travel Channel telling you that you cursed? Like, really? And what did Best use to prove this theory? Only one of the most irrefutable books of the time, the Bible.
Okay, so here again, we're hearing the connection to religion and how religion caused people to come up with these theories. If you remember anything from Ms. Vandersloot's class or have learned anything throughout history, there's these two thoughts at this time period. There was the Great Awakening and the Enlightenment. And the Great Awakening, which we kind of hit on in our review before we started social studies, is all about people realizing how they need God and really pushing for people to come to God and find God. Okay. So that train of thought is happening right now at this time period, as well as a train of thought that science is so important and science tells us how we should live our lives. Okay, so that's the Enlightenment, people coming to their own ideas and their own philosophies and their own understanding of things around them. So with those two thinking, those two train of thoughts happening, they are developing theories about Africans. For some reason, they felt like Africans needed to be thought about. Like they couldn't think for themselves for some reason at this time in place. Because that's the question I ask. Like, why do they keep worrying about the African people? Were the African people a threat? Were the African people an issue? Why were they so focused on the African people? And it never really says why. Um, but it gets to a why later on. So anyway, there's two theories that we're exploring of, you know, why these thoughts happened, why these racist thoughts began, the climate theory, and now the curse theory. So one person decided it couldn't be climate because it was really cold, and Africans that were in a colder place were actually darker than Africans in a warmer climate. So it cannot be climate. So that's where they came up with the curse theory. And they got the curse from what we know as the Bible. And on another note, this part has a lot of the word sex in it. So just kind of be mature as you're listening. And we are maturing in middle school, and we should be able to handle hearing the word sex. So he uses it a lot in this part, but that's kind of how they're describing these people as just having too much sex or doing too much with sex, and they call that evil. So I don't know where this theory came from, but that is what it's saying in this text. All right. So we're listening, and here we go.
In Best's whimsical interpretation of the book of Genesis, Noah orders his white sons not to have sex with their wives on the ark, and then tells them that the first child born after the flood would inherit the earth. When the evil, tyrannical, and hypersexual Ham goes ham and has sex on the ark, God wills that Ham's descendants will be dark and disgusting, and the whole world will look at them as symbols of trouble. Simply put, Ham's kids would be black and bad, ultimately making black bad. Curse theory would become the anchor of what would justify American slavery. It would branch off into another ridiculous idea, the strange concept that because Africans were cursed and because, according to these Europeans, they needed enslavement in order to be saved and civilized, the relationship between slave and master was loving. That it was more like parent and child, or minister and member, mentor mentee. They were painting a compassionate picture about what was certainly a terrible experience because, well, human beings were being forced into servitude, and there's no way to spin that into one big happy family. But the literature said otherwise. That's right. There was another piece of literature, this one written by a man named William Perkins, called Ordering a Family, published in 1590, in which he argued that the slave was just part of a loving family unit that was ordered a particular way, and that the souls and the potential of the souls were equal, but not the skin. It's like saying, I look at my dog like I look at my children, even though I've trained my dog to fetch my paper by beating it and yanking its leash. But the idea of it all let the new enslavers off the emotional hook and portrayed them as benevolent do-gooders, cleaning up the Africans. A generation later, slavery touched down in the newly colonized America, and the people there to usher it in, and more important, to use it to build this new country, were two men, each of whom...
Okay. So right here, we're hearing about more theories coming out. A man named William Perkins, and how he talks about slaves being part of a family, and the only way they can become saved is becoming connected to a white family. And so they're making it out that having an African slave. Now he wrote a book about this. Again, if it's in a book, it's got to be real. But it's just his thoughts. It's no facts. It's no research. It's his thoughts in a book. William Perkins writes a book and says, we would be doing good to these Africans if we make them a part of our family. But the only way they can become a part is if they are slaves. And then we can save them by introducing them to God. So again, they're going back to trying to save them through salvation, through having a relationship with God. Because again, in the Bible, it said that they were cursed through Ham, whose children were darker. All right, so we're going to continue listening.
Saw himself as a similar kind of do-gooder. Their names, John Cotton and Richard Mather. About Cotton and Mather, they were Puritans. About Puritans, they were English Protestants who believed the Reformation of the Church of England was basically watering down Christianity, and they sought to regulate it and keep it more disciplined and rigid. So these two men, at different times, traveled across the Atlantic in search of a new land, which would be Boston, where they could escape English persecution and preach their version, a purer version, of Christianity. They landed in America after treacherous trips, especially Richard Mather, whose ship sailed into a storm in 1635 and almost collided with a massive rock in the ocean. Mather, of course, saw his survival of this journey to America as a miracle and became even more devoted to God. Both men were ministers. They built churches in Massachusetts, but more important, they built systems. The church wasn't just a place of worship. The church was a place of power and influence, and in this new land, John Cotton and Richard Mather had a whole lot of power and influence. And the first thing they did to spread the Puritan way was find other people who were like-minded. And with those like-minded folks, they created schools to enforce higher education skewed toward their way of thinking. What school do you think was the first to get the Puritan touch? This is a trick question, because the answer is the very first university in America ever. Remember, this society is all brand new. And the very first university in America ever was Harvard University. But a tricky thing happens with the opening of Harvard, a thing that directly connects to Zu-Ra-Ra and the curse and climate theories and everything we've talked about thus far. See, Cotton and Mather were students of Aristotle. And Aristotle, though held up as one of the greatest Greek philosophers of all time, famous for things we will not be discussing here because this is not a history book, believed something else he's not nearly as famous for. And that's his belief in human hierarchy. Aristotle believed that Greeks were superior to non-Greeks. John Cotton and Richard Mather took Aristotle's idea because they too were followers and flipped it.
Okay, so quick summary. Now we're listening about John Cotton and Richard Mather, who are two people who were very influential in putting the foundation of the American form of thinking, which still exists now, because they were Puritans and they came from England and they did not like the way they practiced religion in England. So they said, okay, since we don't like it here, we're going to go to the new colonies, because that's what everybody was doing at the time. Everybody was going to the colonies so that they can have their great awakening, so they could share their own ideas of religion. And they wanted that Christianity to be rigid and more disciplined. It wasn't disciplined enough. They didn't have strict enough rules. So they wanted to enforce really strict Christian rules in their form of religion. And then they came to the colonies and they had so much power and so much influence. So they created these churches where people started to follow them. So their way of thinking became the way of thinking. And then they created schools off of their thinking. And the first school they created was Harvard University. And Harvard University is still an institution in America today. And it's still one of the best, considered the best universities in America today. So that Harvard University was founded on Aristotle's theory, that climate theory, that if your skin was, because they lived in a hotter climate, that their skin was darker and people from cooler climates were inferior to people from darker climates. Like that whole thinking ran our country from the 1600s, starting here. That's where people started to follow this thinking. So that's what he's saying. And then also Aristotle has a belief in a human hierarchy. And so that's what he is explaining now. And hierarchy means there's an order. There's a top, there's a middle, and there's a bottom. All right? So that's where we are.
Into a new equation, substituting Puritan for Greek. And because of their miraculous journeys across the raging ocean, especially Richard Mather's, they believed they were a chosen people. special in the eyes of God, Puritan superiority. According to the Puritans, they were better than 1. Native Americans, 2. Anglican English people who weren't Puritans, 3. Everyone else who wasn't a Puritan, 4. Especially African people. And guess what they did during the development of Harvard? They made it so that Greek and Latin texts could not be disputed, which meant Aristotle, a man who believed in human hierarchy and used climate to justify which humans were better, could not be disputed and instead had to be taken as truth. And
So again, here's what they're saying. They created this hierarchy of humans, and based off of climate and based off the color of their skin, you were less inferior. So if you had lighter skin, you were more inferior than the middle, than that. And Puritans took Aristotle's beliefs and changed it. If you were Puritan, you were better than anybody who was not a Puritan. So there's the division, the segregation of first religion and then races, because most people who were Puritans were from Europe, and most people who were Europe had fairer skin, whiter skin. Okay, so this is where it's starting at.
just like that, the groundwork was laid, not only for slavery to be justified, but for it to be justified for a long time, simply because it was woven into the religious and educational systems of America. All that was needed to complete this oppressive puzzle was slaves. America at this time was like one of those games where you have to build the world. A social network of farmers and planters. And if you weren't a farmer planter, then you were a missionary. So you were either dirt folk or church folk. Everyone working to grow on stolen land. Obviously, their native neighbors weren't happy about any of this because their world was being broken while a new world was being planted one seed at a time. And that seed, tobacco. A man named John Porry, a defender of curse theory, the cousin of one of the early major landowners, was named America's first legislative leader. First thing he did was set the price of tobacco, seeing as it would be the country's cash crop. But if tobacco was really going to bring in some money, if it was really going to be the natural resource used to power this country, then they would need more human resource to grow it. See where this is going? In August 1619, a Spanish ship called the San Juan Bautista was hijacked by two pirate ships. The Bautista was carrying 350 Angolans because Latin American slaveholders had already figured out their own slave trading system and had enslaved 250,000 people. The pirates robbed the Bautista, taking 60 of the Angolans. They headed east, eventually coming upon the shores of Jamestown, Virginia. They sold 20 Angolans to the cousin of John Porry, the one with all the land, who happened also to be the governor of Virginia. His name was George Yeardley. And those first 20 slaves for Yeardley and Porry were right on time to work. But remember, America was full of planters and missionaries, and the new slaves would cause a bitter conflict between the two. For the planter, the slave was a big help. It could be the 4-digit code to the American ATM. Here comes the cash. On the flip side, missionaries coming down the line of Puritanism and Zero Ra's propaganda felt slavery was a means to salvation. Planters wanted to grow profits, while missionaries wanted to grow God's kingdom. No one cared what the enslaved African wanted. To start would have been not to be enslaved. They definitely didn't want the religion of their masters, and their masters resisted too. Enslavers weren't interested in hearing anything about converting their slaves. Saving their crops each year was more important to them than saving souls. It was harvest over humanity. And the excuses they gave to avoid baptizing slaves were Africans were too barbaric to be converted. Africans were savage at the soul. Africans couldn't be loved, even by
Okay, so that is the end of our reading for chapter two. That last portion just talked about another person, John Pori, who was the first legislative leader, which means like the person who creates laws for um, the country or the region. And he believed that we needed to make money for this new country. So the first thing he decided they were going to grow was tobacco. And in order to grow lots of tobacco and sell it and trade it to all of these different regions and countries, he decided that the best thing to do was to get more laborers. And so his theory was we needed slaves. All right. And reason he wanted slaves was to make them laborers to work them. Now there was the planters in the country, and then those religious leaders, the Puritans in the country. So they had two different ways of thinking about what needed to happen. The ministers, the missionaries wanted to save everybody, wanted to bring everybody to God and bring Africans from their country to the colonies to help save them. Okay. That's what they wanted to do, make them a part of their family and save them. They were convinced that's how they were going to do it. And then, you know, John Pori wanted to bring the Africans over to make them work and help them make money. And so by the end of the chapter, it talks about how John Pori just refused to take the slaves and baptize them and save their souls because his belief was that they weren't loved by God because they were cursed. Okay, because he believed in the curse theory, that they were too savage to save their souls. And then there was another thought that he had about them, um, and that they were barbaric. So there was no saving them at all. Like, don't even try. So he was just like, whatever, we're going to work them, work them, work them. And that's what we'll do. So that is the end of chapter two. And this is the foundation of racism in America. All right. So at this time, you're going to have a little review quiz over what you've read and heard in chapters one and chapter two. And hopefully you do your best and see you soon.